This is the real story of Cinderella, and it's so much darker than Disney's. In 1697, French author Charles Perrault published a collection of fairy tales that changed literature forever. The stories included in this collection were known as the most beautiful fairy tales selected from the popular stories of ancient and modern times, with the stories being mainly sourced from oral tradition. These stories include some of the most famous tales ever told, such as Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, and Cinderella. Although it was Perrault who wrote them down, these stories had been passed around for hundreds of years before then, with each retelling adding a little something extra to the tale. But despite their popularity, these stories have also been heavily criticized because of their dark themes and messages that some believe are anti-female. Let's take a look at one of the most famous fairy tales of all time, Cinderella. Make sure to stick around until the end, because I'll be sharing the shocking true story that inspired the tale, Cindy Lou Who. First off, let's take a look at the main character, Cindy. In recent adaptations, she's portrayed as a sweet girl who dreams of a better life, a good example being Lily James in the 2021 film. However, in Perrault's original story, Cindy is actually described as being quite lazy. She does nothing but complain all day, which is what prompts her mother to send her away to her father's house. This version of Cinderella is definitely not the sweet girl we've come to know. In fact, she's downright rude. Cindy is disrespectful to both her mother and stepsisters and seems to have no remorse for how they treat her. For example, when they rip up her dress, she responds by saying, "It's just as well I'm going to the ball in rags." Clearly, Cindy is not a victim, but rather someone who deserves the treatment she receives. In addition, unlike the Cindy we all know and love, this Cindy has no animal friends to help her out. Her only source of magic is her fairy, and even she's kind of a jerk, which we'll get into later. A real mean girl. Next, we have Cinderella's stepmother and stepsisters. In the Disney adaptation, they're shown as comedic relief, though they can be quite cruel at times. However, Perrault's stepsisters are outright malicious. They make Cindy's life hell, destroying her clothes, preventing her from eating, and forcing her to sleep by the fireplace. On top of that, they also make fun of her looks, calling her Cinder Girl, because she spends most of her time covered in ashes. And while the stepsisters in the Disney movie are oblivious to Cinderella's identity at the ball, in the original story, they're actually trying to trick Cinderella by disguising themselves as her. They think that if they go to the ball in Cinderella's place, the prince will choose them over her. So while the stepsisters in the movie may seem comical, in the book, they're downright evil. The prince. Now, let's take a look at the prince. We're used to him being a charming and handsome guy who falls in love with Cinderella at first sight. But in the original story, he's portrayed as someone who's a bit of a pervert. At the ball, Cinderella refuses to dance with the prince, telling him, "I do not want to dance with anyone," which makes him angry. He then grabs her hand and forces her to dance with him. Not only that, but after Cinderella flees the palace, the prince becomes obsessed with finding her, and his only motivation is to figure out who she is so he can marry her. In fact, he doesn't care about anything else. When he tells his servants to bring him the girl he danced with, he says, "That matters more to me than all the kingdoms in the world." It's clear that the prince isn't looking for a partner, but rather a trophy wife. He just wants someone beautiful to show off and have everyone admire. And last but not least, there's the fairy. Unlike the hilarious and caring fairy godmother we know, Perrault's fairy is actually quite self-centered. When Cindy is summoned to the fairy's home, she tells the fairy, "I want my old clothes back." The fairy then punishes her, saying, "Oh, would you want to go back to being a cinder girl?" And although the fairy eventually gives Cindy her clothes back, she also warns her to never enter her home again. And to make matters worse, The fairy gives Cinderella a horrible list of demands she must follow to ensure that the prince chooses her at the ball. These demands are not only pointless, but also extremely selfish. They serve no other purpose than to make Cinderella miserable. And unlike in the Disney version, the fairy isn't some magical being who wants to help Cinderella. Rather, she's a vindictive creature who only helps her out of spite. So now that we've gone through each of the main characters, let's take a deeper look into the plot. Glass slippers or golden? One of the most iconic parts of the Cinderella story is her glass slippers. And while the Disney version shows her wearing golden slippers to the ball, in the original story, Cinderella wears red ones. However, this detail is often overlooked because the story actually refers to her slippers as mules, which are open-backed shoes worn during the 17th century. And although the Disney version opted to call them glass slippers, this was a mistranslation. The original French phrase was pantoufles de verre, which translates to golden slippers. But regardless of what you want to call them, Cinderella's footwear is one of the most important parts of the story because it's the main clue the prince uses to find her. After losing one of her golden slippers at the ball, the prince becomes obsessed with finding its owner. And despite having an entire kingdom to rule, he spends his days searching for the shoe. It's clear that the prince isn't interested in Cinderella for who she is, but rather for what she represents. He just wants a beautiful woman to boast about. And the only reason he becomes fixated on Cinderella is because of her shoe. A shocking twist ending. Another aspect of the story that's often overlooked is its ending. Most people remember the classic line, "They lived happily ever after," but Perrault's version actually ends quite differently. After the prince finds Cinderella and discovers her identity, he immediately takes her back to the palace and marries her. However, the cruel stepsisters aren't punished. Instead, Perrault writes, the two stepsisters repented of the ill treatment they had done her. There's no mention of them being sorry for their actions or facing any kind of consequences. And although Cinderella might have become a princess, that doesn't mean she's happy. In fact, Perrault writes that she's miserable and bored. The story ends with her giving birth to twins and dying soon after. So contrary to popular belief, Cinderella's story doesn't have a happy ending. If anything, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of vanity and the importance of remaining humble. What inspired the story? Now that we've gone through the main points of the story, let's take a look at what inspired Perrault to write it. Despite being considered a children's story, Cinderella has very adult themes, including sexual exploitation, child abuse, and misogyny. And although Perrault didn't invent these themes, he certainly capitalized on them. The author wrote Cinderella at the height of his career, shortly after his most famous work, Sleeping Beauty, was published. And Cinderella was one of several stories included in his collection of fairy tales. However, even though it was just one story among many, Cinderella quickly became the most famous and has remained so for centuries. And the reason for this is quite simple. Cinderella is a story about transformation. She goes from being a poor, ugly girl to a beautiful princess, which appeals to our desire to improve ourselves. And while this may seem like a harmless message, it can also be quite dangerous. Cinderella teaches us that beauty is what truly matters in life, and that those who are ugly and poor deserve to be treated poorly. And although this may seem like a harsh message, it's not uncommon for people to believe it. According to statistics from the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, nearly 200,000 cosmetic procedures were performed in 2020 alone, and it's clear that our obsession with beauty will continue to grow. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more just like it, be sure to check out more content. With that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.